The auditorium had just settled into their seats for the keynote when Dr. Preston Wade stood up from the front row before I'd even finished my introduction slide and told 400 researchers that the paper I was about to present had been built entirely on unpublished work he'd shared with me in confidence 2 years earlier. I was standing at the podium with the clicker still in my hand, my name and the title of my dissertation research glowing behind me on the screen, when his voice carried clean across the room, and every head turned first to him, then to me. He said it with the calm authority of a man who'd spent 30 years being believed in rooms exactly like this one, that he'd mentored me, trusted me with early findings from his own lab notebooks, and watched with quiet dismay over the past year as I quietly rebranded his ideas as my own, without so much as a footnote, acknowledging where they came from. The conference chair, a woman named Dr. Okafor, who I'd exchanged maybe 3 emails with in my life, looked between us with the expression of someone deciding in real time whether to shut the session down entirely. My advisor's own graduate students, seated together near the back, went rigid in their chairs, clearly unsure whether they should be looking at him or at me. A few rows back, someone's phone was already tilted upward, quietly recording, and I remember registering that detail with a strange, distant clarity, even as my pulse pounded in my ears. Some part of my brain already understanding that whatever happened in the next few minutes wasn't going to stay contained to this room. A senior researcher I recognized from a journal editorial board leaned toward his colleague and murmured something. And I watched the murmur spread outward table by table the way bad news always seems to travel faster than anything good ever does. I said his name once, quiet, the way you say a name when part of you still hopes the person will stop themselves before it becomes something neither of you can take back. And he looked at me with the same patient disappointment he used in seminar. When a student got a citation wrong, like this was simply another correction he was obligated to make in public. I joined Preston's lab 6 years earlier as a first-year graduate student who barely understood how to run a proper literature review, showing up to my first meeting with him, having misformatted every citation in my sample proposal. And for a long time, I believed he genuinely shaped who I became as a researcher. I remembered him staying past midnight with me the week before my qualifying exam, working through practice questions on his own whiteboard until I finally stopped shaking every time someone asked me to defend a methodology choice. I remembered him personally driving me to the emergency room the semester I collapsed from exhaustion during finals, sitting in the waiting room grading undergraduate papers just so I wouldn't be alone when the doctor came out. I remembered the letter of recommendation he wrote for my first fellowship application. 4 single-spaced pages praising my independent thinking and language so generous I'd nearly cried reading it in his office. I remembered him introducing me at my first real conference as the future of the field, his hand on my shoulder, genuine pride in his voice that I'd spent years afterward trying to live up to. I remember the two of us staying in his office until the building's cleaning crew politely asked us to leave, arguing happily over a stubborn methodology problem that had stumped me for weeks, until he finally sketched a single diagram on a napkin that made the whole thing click into place, and I'd kept that napkin folded in my desk drawer for years afterward like some kind of talisman. None of that mattered under those lights, with 400 researchers suddenly wondering whether the promising young scholar they'd come to hear was actually a thief who'd stolen her mentor's work. What Preston didn't know, what only my partner Julian and my dissertation committee's outside reader knew, was that 18 months before that conference, I had grown quietly uneasy about how closely Preston had begun asking about the specific direction of my independent research. Questions that felt less like mentorship and more like reconnaissance. So I'd started keeping meticulous version controlled backups of every draft, every data set, every notebook entry, time-stamped automatically through the university's research archive system, precisely because a colleague in another lab had warned me the year before that Preston had a documented history of folding students' original ideas into his own published work once they got too close to something genuinely new. I hadn't wanted to believe her at the time, remembering how warmly Preston had always spoken about his former students in seminar, using their names like proof of his own generosity as a mentor. She'd shown me an old paper of his from a decade earlier, where a footnote thanking a former student for early discussions had later been quietly removed in the published version, after that student had already left the program disillusioned and never finished her own dissertation, a detail that had unsettled me for weeks before I eventually convinced myself it was probably an isolated, misunderstood incident, rather than any kind of pattern. I'd filed that story away without fully processing it, some part of me insisting our relationship was different, until small things started happening that made her warning feel less like gossip and more like a pattern I was watching unfold in real time. The week after the conference exploded, I barely left my apartment, running through what university policy actually required for a formal academic misconduct complaint, since the department chair had already called an emergency committee meeting before I'd even finished packing up my poster board. Julian sat with me most nights going through the university's research archive logs, pulling every timestamp on every file I'd touched over the past 2 years, cross-referencing them against the dates on Preston's own supposed unpublished notebooks to see whether his claimed timeline could even hold up against mine. He built a simple spreadsheet on his laptop, one column for my file timestamps and one for Preston's claimed dates. And by the second night, the pattern was obvious enough that he turned the screen toward me without saying anything, just letting the dates speak for themselves. At one point, Julian asked, carefully, whether I'd considered that Preston might genuinely believe some version of what he'd said at the podium, that maybe in his own memory the ideas had blurred together after years of running so many overlapping projects with so many students. I told him it didn't matter what Preston believed in his own head anymore, because I had 18 months of dated, verifiable proof that my central findings existed in my own files, developed independently, months before he'd ever claimed to have shared anything with me at all. Julian closed the laptop around 3 in the morning, made us both tea we barely drank, and told me that whatever the committee decided, the timestamps weren't going to change no matter how many times Preston told the story differently. 3 days before the department committee convened, an email arrived from a former student of Preston's named Renata, someone I'd met exactly once at a departmental mixer years earlier and hadn't spoken to since. She said she'd heard through the field's small gossipy grapevine what had happened at the conference and wanted to share something she'd sat on for nearly 8 years. Never quite sure it was her place to say anything. She said that during her own time in Preston's lab, she'd recorded one of their private research meetings for her own note-taking purposes, a habit her previous advisor had encouraged, and that recording happened to capture Preston explicitly instructing her to remove a co-author's name from an upcoming submission because, in his words, senior authors get remembered and junior contributors get forgotten anyway, so there was no real harm in simplifying the byline. She said she left the program shortly after that conversation, partly because of how uncomfortable it had made her, switching fields entirely and eventually building a career far outside academia, where she said she'd never once regretted the decision, despite how much it had cost her early ambitions. She said she'd kept the recording all these years, without ever finding a reason to use it, assuming nobody would believe an unverified audio file from someone who'd left academia entirely, and had honestly forgotten it existed for long stretches at a time until the news about the conference reached her secondhand, through an old classmate's social media post. She said if it would help me now, she wanted to finally do something with it, instead of letting it sit forgotten on an old hard drive. I told her it might help more than she realized. The department committee meeting was tense from the moment everyone sat down around the long conference table, Dr. Okafor included as an outside observer, given how publicly the accusation had unfolded. Preston repeated his claim from the conference stage, more measured this time, laying out a folder of handwritten notebook pages. He said predated my own work by nearly 2 years. I let him finish completely before saying anything, because I wanted the committee to hear the full shape of his story before I began taking it apart piece by piece. Then I walked them through the university archive's time-stamped version history for every file connected to my central findings, showing that my earliest drafts existed a full 6 months before the dates Preston claimed to have first shared anything with me, verified independently by the university's own Research Integrity Office, rather than anything I could have manipulated myself. Preston said notebooks weren't always logged the same way digital files were, that his handwritten pages simply hadn't been formally dated, because that wasn't how he'd ever worked. And for a moment, a couple of committee members exchanged uncertain glances, like maybe that gap in the record left room for doubt. Dr. Simmons asked whether any of the notebook pages referenced dated departmental events or seminars that could independently anchor them in time, and Preston said he'd need to check his records more carefully before answering that. An answer that struck several people at the table as strange for a man who'd built his entire case on the certainty of those very pages. That was when I played Renata's recording for the committee, Preston's own voice from years earlier, calmly instructing a different student to strip a co-author's name from a paper because junior contributors were easy to forget. The room went utterly silent except for the low hum of the air conditioning. Preston's expression shifted the way a person's does when they realize a private habit they assumed was buried forever has just resurfaced in front of the only people whose judgment could actually end their career. He said the recording was old, unrelated to the specific situation, taken wildly out of context from a conversation he barely remembered having. But Dr. Okafor asked flatly whether he was denying it was his voice on the recording, and he didn't answer that question directly at all. One of the newer committee members, a young associate professor named Dr. Simmons, who'd only joined the faculty the previous year, asked quietly whether this meant the pattern described might extend to other students across Preston's long career. And the department chair said that given what had just been heard, the university's Research Integrity Office would need to open a broader review, going back considerably further than my own case alone. Preston gathered his folder without another word and left the room, and nobody moved to stop him. The fallout moved through the department slowly but completely over the following months. The university placed Preston on administrative leave, pending the full misconduct review, and within the semester, he formally resigned rather than face a public hearing that several other former students, encouraged by Renata coming forward, had begun quietly requesting to join. Two journals that had published his most recent papers issued formal notices flagging them for review, while co-authorship claims across his career were re-examined one by one. A National Research Society that had scheduled him to receive a Lifetime Achievement Award that same year quietly removed his name from the program without any public statement, the kind of silence that everyone in the field understood exactly how to read. A graduate textbook that had listed him as a contributing editor for its upcoming edition dropped his chapter entirely, replacing it with a new section written by two junior researchers he'd once supervised, neither of whom had spoken publicly about why the change happened. Even so, three younger researchers who had once hoped to work in Preston's lab someday found themselves suddenly without a mentor track they'd built their whole graduate school plans around, an unintended cost that had nothing to do with what any of them had actually done wrong. And I felt for them even as I couldn't bring myself to regret what had come out. Preston reached out to me by email nearly 2 months later, not asking to meet in person, just a short message saying he was sorry. That 30 years of watching younger researchers eventually eclipse the work he'd built his identity around had worn something down in him that he'd never properly examined until it was far too late to fix quietly. He said he genuinely believed, in some distorted way he couldn't fully explain even to himself, that mentorship entitled him to a claim on the ideas that grew out of it, and that he understood now how much damage that belief had caused across more years and more students than just me. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought at the very end of the message, that he'd started seeing a therapist for the first time in his life, which struck me as both a small mercy and a strange kind of proof that whatever reckoning he was finally having had come only after there was nothing left to protect by avoiding it. I read the email twice and didn't respond right away. When I finally did, I told him I appreciated the honesty, that I didn't fully understand it, and that I hoped whatever came next for him involved actually reckoning with it, rather than simply disappearing quietly the way his resignation had let him do. The unexpected part came the following year, when my dissertation committee gently suggested that finishing my degree fully independent of Preston's old department, at a different university willing to bring me on with full standing and my existing research intact, would likely serve my career better than trying to complete my final year in a program still working through the fallout of his resignation. It wasn't the ending I wanted. Watching 6 years in a lab I'd once loved quietly close behind me. The same lab where I'd learned everything I actually knew about the kind of researcher I wanted to become. The same whiteboard where he'd sketched that napkin diagram years earlier, now belonging to someone else's office entirely. But within a few months, I transferred to a new university with my full body of work intact, defended my dissertation the following spring in front of a committee that had never heard of Preston Wade outside the headlines, and Julian sat in the front row the whole time, the way he had every hard year before it, holding up a small handwritten sign when I finished that just said, "Proud of you," which nearly undid me more than the entire defense itself had. Sometimes late at night, I still think about the version of this story where none of it ever came out, where Preston kept being trusted the way he'd trusted himself for 30 years. And I remind myself that proving the truth cost me a lab I loved, but keeping quiet would have cost me everything else instead. If you've ever had someone who shaped who you became try to claim you as their own creation, instead of letting you be your own person, you know that winning doesn't always look like staying. Sometimes it looks like finally being free to start again somewhere your work is only ever yours. If this story hit home for you, hit like and subscribe. because there's another one coming next week.